It was a chilly Monday morning when Rachel walked into the White Oak Bank. She was dressed in a simple, neat outfit, nothing flashy, but well put together. You could see she carried herself with grace, though maybe her expression carried a hint of nervousness. She had every right to feel that way. Rachel had spent years saving, working tirelessly in different jobs, and she'd recently come into the possession of a check that could change her life. But standing in that bank, she was still uncertain of what it meant for her future. She approached the counter with her check in hand, which she'd received as part of her recent business acquisition. The whole process of buying the bank was an unexpected journey, something she had never imagined she would have to do. But her vision had led her here, and now she just had to cash the check. Behind the counter stood a man, Mark, the manager of the bank. He greeted her with a polite smile, yet though there was something in his eyes that was hard to ignore. It wasn't exactly kindness, but more like a polite indifference, one that you'd get from someone who didn't really expect anything out of the ordinary to happen in their day. He glanced at her, then at the check she handed over. As he looked it over, his expression faltered, and a faint sigh left his lips. Rachel could feel a subtle tension rise in the air, but she tried to remain calm. "I'm sorry, miss, but there seems to be an issue with this check," Mark said, still scanning it with a furrowed brow. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to hide the anxiety in her voice. Mark didn't look up. "This check isn't valid. It's from a source I can't verify. I'm afraid I won't be able to process it." Rachel's mind raced. She had done everything by the book. Everything. Yet, here she was, being told that something she knew should be legitimate, something that represented years of hard work, was being dismissed so easily. She felt the weight of his words pressing against her chest, but she didn't want to show it. She stood her ground, still trying to make sense of the situation. "Please double-check. It's a legitimate transaction." Mark finally looked up, his gaze cold. "I'm afraid I can't do that. The check's amount is too high, and the bank doesn't usually process these kinds of checks unless we know the source." Rachel's stomach tightened. This was it. Her entire plan, everything she had worked for, was standing on the edge of something so fragile. But little did Mark know, this wasn't just any check. This was the check that represented her ownership of White Oak Bank itself. Rachel could feel her pulse quicken as she stood there, waiting for Mark to do something. He hadn't yet returned her check, and her mind raced. She wasn't just any woman walking into this bank. She was someone who had spent years building a future, putting every bit of herself into something she believed in. And now, she was being told that the check she held was worthless. "Is there someone else I can speak to?" she asked, her voice steady, but there was a slight edge to it now. Mark seemed to hesitate for a moment before he shook his head. "No, I'm the manager here. I've handled all the accounts for years. There's nothing more to discuss." His tone was final, almost dismissive. Rachel's hands clenched. She wasn't sure if it was pride or frustration, but something told her she couldn't leave without making him understand just how wrong he was. "I'm telling you, this check is good. You're making a mistake," she said, her voice softer but firm. "Please just give me a moment to make a call. You'll see I'm not just some woman trying to cash a fake check." Mark barely looked up from his desk as he replied, "I don't have time for this. If you want to try another bank, be my guest." Rachel stood frozen for a moment, feeling every inch of the tension that filled the space between them. The nerve of this man, the audacity. But she knew better than to lose her cool. She couldn't afford to. She stepped back, pulling out her phone, but just as she was about to dial the number, she heard the voice of another employee, an assistant, calling to Mark from the back office. "Mr. Hayes, the owner of the bank is on the phone. She wants to speak with you. She's requesting an immediate meeting." Rachel's eyes widened. The bank owner? Did she just hear that right? Mark shot a glance at Rachel, his face flickering with surprise. He quickly stood up, walking over to the office door, his demeanor now shifting. "Excuse me," he muttered, his voice much more polite now. It was like he didn't even see her anymore. She was left standing there, her heart beating faster now. She didn't need to guess who the owner was, because she was the owner. With a quiet breath, Rachel gathered herself. The moment she'd been waiting for had arrived. Her phone buzzed in her hand and she answered. "Rachel, this is Ms. Caldwell, the head of operations here. There's been a little misunderstanding," the voice on the other end said, a slight tension in her tone. "We've received word that the bank manager has declined your check. We're rectifying the situation immediately." Rachel held the phone to her ear, her chest heavy with emotions. She wanted to say so much, but all that came out was a simple, "Thank you." Just then, Mark returned to the counter, his expression a complete 180 from earlier. He looked at Rachel with wide eyes, his voice trembling slightly. "I don't know what happened. There must have been some kind of confusion," he stammered. Rachel didn't respond. There was nothing more to say. She'd known from the moment he first looked at her that this wasn't about the check. It was about something far deeper. Something that had nothing to do with her qualifications or her business. But Mark had no way of knowing the truth. Rachel wasn't just a customer here. She was now the one in charge. Rachel barely held back the weight of the emotions swirling inside her as she stared at Mark, who was now trying to mask his earlier disapproval with forced politeness. It was almost laughable how quickly things had shifted. He cleared his throat awkwardly. I'll just call the head office to verify things," he said, fumbling for his phone. His hands were shaking slightly, and Rachel could tell he was trying his best to regain control of the situation. But it was too late for that. His earlier judgment, his immediate assumption that she didn't belong here, hung heavily in the air. She had been dismissed. Just another woman who didn't fit his idea of a banking customer. How many other people had been treated like this? She didn't want to make a scene, but the injustice of it was eating at her. "Actually," Rachel said, her voice calm but firm, "I think there's been enough waiting." Mark looked up at her, his expression confused. "I am the new owner of White Oak Bank," Rachel continued, her gaze steady. The words felt surreal, even to her, but she said them anyway. "I didn't think I'd need to announce it like this, but it looks like I do." There was a long silence as Mark's face drained of color. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Rachel continued, "I'm the one who holds the keys now. The bank you've been working at all these years? I own it. So, when you said my check wasn't valid, you were talking about your own employer's funds." It was like a slow realization dawned on him. He tried to hide it, but the shock was visible. He blinked a few times, not sure how to respond. His fingers trembled as he put his phone down on the counter. "You," Mark stuttered, then cleared his throat. "I didn't know. I didn't recognize you." Rachel nodded, but her expression remained unreadable. "I figured as much. It's okay, I understand. You didn't know. But I want you to think about something for a moment." She leaned in slightly, her voice softer now, but every word cutting through the tension. "How many times have you assumed people didn't belong in spaces they rightfully own? How many others have you dismissed like this, just because they didn't fit your idea of who should be in charge? How many people have walked out of here because you didn't bother to give them a chance?" Mark's face flushed, the weight of her words slowly sinking in. He looked like he wanted to apologize, but no words came out. He just stood there, frozen, struggling with the truth she had laid bare. Rachel wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't even upset. She was just tired. Tired of this. Tired of the systems that constantly told her she didn't belong in the places she fought so hard to be. Tired of people who couldn't see beyond their biases. "I hope you learn from this," she said quietly, finally turning away. "I'll be back soon. But next time, please check who you're judging before you make assumptions. Not everyone who walks through these doors is a stranger." As she turned and walked out of the bank, she felt a weight lift from her chest. It wasn't a victory she'd planned for, but it was one she'd earned. A few days passed after Rachel's confrontation with Mark, and things at the bank started to change. There was a ripple, like a wave that spread across the employees. Some were nervous, others were curious, and some seemed embarrassed by the whole incident. But one thing was clear. Rachel's presence had shaken up the place. On her return, she didn't immediately confront anyone. Instead, she walked through the halls of the bank like she owned every inch of it. Which, in fact, she did. The employees who had once looked past her or seen her as just another person in the way, now watched her with a mix of respect and wariness. They knew things were changing. and it wasn't just the fact that the bank now had a new owner. It was everything Rachel represented. When Rachel reached Mark's office, he wasn't there, but his assistant was. The young woman looked at her, a little uncomfortable but also trying to stay professional. "Miss Davis, welcome back," she said, forcing a smile. "Mr. Hayes will be in shortly." Rachel nodded, feeling a sense of calm that surprised her. She had done what she needed to do. No more proving herself, no more being second-guessed. Her actions had spoken louder than any words could. As Mark walked in, he immediately apologized, his voice quieter than before. "Ms. Davis, I want to start by saying I'm sorry for what happened the other day. I didn't mean to disrespect you, and I see now that I acted wrongly." Rachel looked at him for a long moment, taking in the sincerity in his eyes. He wasn't just apologizing because he had to. He was apologizing because he understood the gravity of his mistake. "I appreciate the apology, Mark," Rachel said, her voice soft. "But you have to understand, this goes beyond just one interaction. It's about the mindset that people like me are often overlooked or underestimated. People like you need to realize that we belong here, just as much as anyone else. It's time to let go of those old beliefs and welcome change." Mark nodded, his shoulders slumping as if a weight had been lifted off them. "You're right, and I want you to know, I'll do everything I can to make things right. I don't want to be part of the problem anymore." Rachel gave him a small smile. "That's all I ask, a little effort to do better." And with that, Rachel turned and walked out of his office, her heart a little lighter. There was still work to be done, but this was a start. A small but important step toward making sure people like her, people who had been underestimated and dismissed, no longer had to fight for their place. As she left the building that day, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Not just because she had proven herself in the eyes of one man, but because she had made a statement. She wasn't just a woman walking into a bank, she was a force to be reckoned with. And this bank, her bank, was going to be better because of it. Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed this story and the journey we took with Rachel. If this tale resonated with you, don't forget to hit that like button, it really helps. And if you're new here, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on more stories just like this. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so drop a comment below. What do you think Rachel's journey teaches us? And if you know someone who would love this story, please share it with them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.